I'd like to welcome everyone today to Dairy XNet's webinar on diagnosing problems in nutrition programs through records. Without much ado, I'd like to introduce to you Greg Bethard. He today will be presenting the topic Diagnosing Problems in Nutrition Programs Through Records. Greg received his BS, MS, and PhD degrees from Virginia Tech in Dairy Nutrition and Management. Following graduate school, he was on the faculty at New Mexico State University and then worked as a technical service specialist for Monsanto Dairy Business. Since 2000, Greg has operated G&R Dairy Consulting with his wife. This particular consulting firm serves clients throughout the U.S., Europe, and Mexico, focusing on nutrition, facilities, management, business planning, and financial and record analysis services. In 2009, Greg joined Dairy Records Management Systems in Raleigh, North Carolina, and currently focuses on improving records analysis software. He has published articles in the Journal of Dairy Science and written articles for various dairy magazines throughout the U.S. and the world. He has given presentations to dairy producers and allied industry throughout the U.S., Mexico, and Italy. And with that, Greg, we welcome you today to present this topic for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Hopefully we can get this, there we go. Welcome everybody. It's the week of Thanksgiving. Everybody's, I'm surprised how many people are actually signed up here. I see the list on the left, a lot of people I know, some people who are probably better suited to teach this webinar than I am, but we'll give it a shot anyways. My topic is records and kind of looking at the nutrition program, and I'm more focused on transition cows. So I'm going to a lot of what I'm going to cover, pretty much most of what I'm going to cover, is very basic, very simple. It's not, I'm not going to go into a lot of higher math and higher statistics, just kind of taking a simple look at ways that I think are worthwhile to track how fresh cows are doing and how cows are transitioning. I'm not going to really focus on any particular herd management program. I'll reference PC Dart and Dairy Comp. They're the two that I'm most familiar with. But most of what I'll present, hopefully, if you have a different system, that you'll be able to get that out of there as well. So my title, again, is Using Records to Troubleshoot Transition Cow Performance. And some of the concepts I'd like to get across today that I feel are important for you to take away from this is, number one, benchmarking is a really bad idea with a lot of these fresh cow metrics. I'll give you very few metrics, actually, in terms of a number to strive for, talk about things to calculate. And I think what's most important is that dairies with their advisors set goals appropriate for the dairy. So you can look at industry benchmarks, see what other people are doing, kind of as a place to start to see what is success for that dairy, and then set goals that make sense for the dairy, that are achievable for the dairy, that will mean financial success for the dairy. And I sure think that's not the same for every dairy. So don't just benchmark numbers, but set goals appropriately. Number two here is pay attention to what is being measured and how it is measured. I'll emphasize this a lot, some errors or some pitfalls we'll have with certain numbers. More than anything, when we see a number, particularly an average where there's one number capturing a lot of data, think about what went into that number, what cows are represented in that metric, how it's calculated, where it could go wrong, because a lot of the things we look at really have some goofs in them that we're not aware of unless we really think about it. Third, economics trumps biology. I'll talk a little bit about in the end some ways to economically evaluate cow performance instead of just biological measures. So when we think about transition cows, you know, we're all that work with dairies are keenly aware of this. It obviously drives the bus long-term on financial success for the dairy. But what is success? What are we looking to accomplish? And I think this is important to think through. We need to develop questions first before we start looking at records, and I think we need to define, hey, what's success for our facility, for our management, for the way we do things and the resources that we have. So for me, kind of broadly, I put success in three areas. Number one, I think we want healthy transition. I think we want cows to transition with few health problems that are come through that period, 30 days in milk in good condition, eating well, feeling well, without a lot of disease issues. So healthy, there's a lot of definitions of what healthy may be. We may interpret that differently, but I think we all agree we want healthy cows through transition. We want to see cows that are ready to get pregnant. So when this transition process is complete, we like to see cows that are cycling and ready to go and have everything in place from a physiological standpoint that she is ready to get pregnant. And number 3, we'd like to see them getting a good start to lactation. So their milk production and how they begin the lactation is conducive to a long and productive lactation. So really these 3 areas I think are the key areas of success. If we can accomplish all 3 of those, I think we can say, hey, we're achieving success in transition. So we'll focus on some metrics as we get through this in all 3 of those areas. There's some questions we might ask relative to those 3 areas, and then some metrics that we might use to answer those questions. Whoops. I'm not sure what's going on here. Hey, Donna?
Yeah. Can you advance the slide?
I'm trying to. It won't.
Let me see if I can.
Okay. Oh,
There you
we
go.
go. Okay. So what are the questions? I just alluded to this. I think it's important to formulate the questions appropriate for the dairy. This is a great discussion for advisors and dairy management team to have together to say, gee, what are the appropriate questions we have about our dairy relative to transition? Once we establish those questions, we can develop some monitoring systems to track those. I think we certainly want to develop systems that allow us to answer questions quickly being the operative word. With the way transition performance affects the herd for such a long period of time, that if we don't figure out transition problems until it's several months down the road, we've dug a pretty deep hole that we're going to pay for in the next year as cows freshen in the next time. They may not get pregnant, and there's a whole host of downstream effects from poor transition performance. So it's imperative that whatever monitoring system that we have in place, it enables us to quickly discover when the bus has made a left turn, and we can hop in, hopefully intervene, and prevent the problem from getting any worse. I think we also need to consider parity differences. For me, I always separate lactation equal 1 and lactation greater than 1. When I'm looking at transition metrics, to me, they're completely different populations. The issues are different usually between the 2. The physiology is different, and I think most often the solutions are different. Just something as simple as calcium metabolism is quite different by parity, and I think we can go on to many other aspects as well. So whenever I'm looking at transition metrics, as we'll get into, I always separate it by parity. I think it's imperative that we do so. Some watch-outs in looking at numbers, and there's a lot of them. First of all is repeats, and we start looking in health events like DAs and RPs and metritis and things like that. We need to be aware that we could have repeats. In other words, we could have more than 1 event per cow. Good example would be metritis. 1 cow may be recorded multiple times for metritis if the dairy is using metritis as an indicator of treatment. So what we're really after when we're looking at a metric like metritis is, in most cases, we want to know incidence of disease. So what percentage of cows that freshened in a particular window had metritis? Well, the way we control that in PC DART is with activity intervals, and in dairy comp with event gaps. They both function in a similar manner, and what they do is set a number of days to where we flag it being a new event. So, for example, if we put in an activity interval or event gap as 10 days for metritis, any metritises that occur that are less than 10 days apart will be essentially tagged as a repeat and taken off of our counts. So if you're not familiar with either of those, both programs have some help areas where you can learn those, become aware of those, and make sure you put in appropriate event gaps or intervals for all those fresh cow events like RPs, metritis, and DAs and whatnot, or even mastitis. So the second watch out is having too few cows. This happens with small herds with most all transition metrics. You know, a 100-cow dairy is freshening 10 cows a month. If we segregate that into parity groups, then we're only ending up with a few animals potentially per month calving. And boy, that can really cause some statistical issues we'll get into here in a while. But just any time we see a transition metric that's a percentage or an average or something, we need to know how many cows went into that calculation to make sure that we're really able to distinguish differences. Ignoring failures is a common mistake with transition metrics. By failures, I mean animals that were culled. In a lot of our record-keeping systems, we're not aware that when we ask for metrics, we're only including cows currently in the herd. So again, be aware of what animals went into the metric you're calculating. I think it's crucial that we consider all the cows that were sold or died in our metrics. We want to report our failures. It's kind of like taking a course in college and any test that you fail, throwing it out and only averaging the scores of the exams that you pass. Well, that wouldn't make any sense. I don't think it likewise makes any sense to throw out all our cows that we failed on and got out the door and not include those in calculating our metrics, because I think it otherwise will overestimate how good the dairy performed. Next is inconsistent diagnosis of disease. Certainly comparing disease diagnosis between dairies or disease incidence between dairies, like an RP, like a metritis, is fraught with error because dairies just don't diagnose in the same manner. An RP is not the same on every dairy, and metritis is certainly not the same on every dairy. But even within a dairy, these things can shift as employee turnover, different protocols are put in place, and we need to be aware that disease diagnosis may be inconsistent. So in interpreting that, be careful that we don't make too much out of something until we know how it's been recorded. Next set of watch-outs, inaccurate milk weights or parlor meter errors. A lot of dairies that have their own meters don't really keep track of their meter errors, that they're accurately recording milk weights. Sometimes you'll get some rogue meters. Test day weights can often be very inaccurate. Unfortunately, a lot of herds that I see, their test day weights are 6 or 8 pounds different than the actual tank weights that day for the dairy. So just be aware that that those test day weights or parlor meter weights could be wrong. I always like to know what the tank average is on the dairy around test day to see if the weights are in the ballpark. They don't have to be perfect, but they ought to be within a couple pounds. If not, relative differences to prior months may be inaccurate. Dairy calls. We're in an era now that people are able to get cows pregnant like they never have before. We have big heifer herds from sex semen and better care for our heifers. So there's a lot of dairies that have the opportunity to cull and remove animals for dairy purposes. They may freshen heifers and sell fresh heifers. They may sell fresh cows. They may sell heifers. So we need to be aware that some of the culls on a dairy may be dairy culls, and I think it's important that we take those out. When I'm assessing cull rates in early lactation, I always remove those dairy culls because I don't think that should be counted as a negative. Misleading metrics, and I'll go through those in a minute. But again, this is kind of a big list of watch-outs. There's a lot of things, and that's where that on the first slide there, I say pay attention to what you're measuring and what cows go into the map. There's a lot of pitfalls here, a lot of places that we can make inappropriate judgments and really lead us in the wrong direction. So misleading metrics, we've sure got a lot of those. Peak milk is probably one of the leading ones. I just don't like using peak milk at all. It's lagging. It's got too much momentum. We typically ignore the failures and how it's generally calculated, and I think it's rather vague and imprecise. So I've gotten away from using peak milk. I'll offer some better metrics, I think, as we go through here. So the concept of peak, I think, is fine, knowing how high the lactation curve was. I just don't think the way we measure it is the best way to go about answering that question. First test day milk, I think, also has errors. The smaller the herd, the bigger these errors will be, in my opinion. So we've got a range error, meaning that some test day intervals are 30 days or 25 days. Some test day intervals are 40 or 50 days. So first test day milk is just our first test at lactation. So if we have 40-day test intervals, first test day milk are cows 0 to 40 days. If we happen to have a 25-day test interval, first test day milks are 1 to 25 days. So we've definitely got a range error. We also have an average error that on one particular test day, first test day milk, the cows may average 15 days in milk. On another test day, they may average 17 or 18. Another, they may average 10, depending on distribution of when animals calve. So again, smaller herds, not calving as many, you tend to not have a uniform distribution of calvings throughout the month, and you can get some wildly different numbers. The way the lactation curve is shaped, being off 5 to 10 days on the range or the average days in milk can really change our interpretation of that number. So I just avoid first test day milks as a metric, and again, I'll give you some better numbers later. Next is conception rates. unless we know the breeding program well in the dairy. We'll talk about this again in a minute, but we don't want to compare between dairies, but even within a dairy, be sure we know what we're measuring and what cows went into it and which cows we're ignoring in the calculation. Fat test is a proxy for health. I've never been a fan of just looking at how many cows have a high fat test or fat protein ratios, inversions, those sorts of things. I'm not saying they never have any value. I think they're potentially worthwhile as another piece of damning evidence if we have other issues, but I think it should never be a primary diagnosis. I think it assesses risk for a herd potentially, but boy, we need to be really careful, and I really don't think that they are necessarily correlated to health. I think that's often overstated. So I think fat test tracking changes over time is worthwhile, and with an individual herd may associate that with some other issues, but not using that as a primary diagnostic tool. So these misleading metrics really have one of these four problems. I give a few examples of each. We've got metrics that have too much variation, which is generally too few cows. It's a small herd problem. But when we're looking at transition cow metrics, we often end up with too few cows because we're looking at shorter windows. Even though the herd may be reasonably big, we're looking at animals that freshen over a shorter period of time, and our N, or number of cows in the denominator, can tend to get a little small. Metrics with bias. Bias is where we're ignoring animals. The conception rate example I'll go through in a minute. Metrics with momentum, where we got too much time into the calculation. And metrics with lag, where it takes too long to measure what we're looking at. So I'll go through a few examples of those here quickly. For most of you, this is nothing new, but I think it's worthwhile to go through this basic information. So variation is when one number greatly distorts the results. And this is really a small herd problem more than anything else. And when I say a problem, that's not that there's anything wrong with small herds, but we just got to be aware and make sure that we don't have variation issues distorting our interpretations of a herd. So here's a simple example. We have DA rate on a herd. So let's go back to our 100-cow dairy example and say there were 10 animals that freshened in the month of January. And let's say there were no DAs that month, so our DA rate would be 0 out of 10. That would be 0%. And let's say we roll into February the next month and we're recording the same thing. Now we had 1 DA, and 1 DA out of 10 freshening, suppose that we had again, would be a 10% rate. So one animal changed us from a 0% rate, which is good as we could be, to a 10% rate, which is somebody's getting fired bad. So 10% is obviously a huge number of DAs, but again, only one animal changed our interpretation. So think about all the transition metrics. Pregnancy rate, often we get into the same issue where our eligible cows are not nearly enough. DA rates, culling rates, RP rates, even startup milk weights, all these sorts of things we look at. We need to be careful of how many cows went into that observation, particularly when we separate by parity. So the solution of variation is simple. We just need to add more time, which is going to grab more cows. We don't want to add too much time because then we'll lead into our momentum problems, which we'll see next, but we simply need to add more time. So for me, this is kind of just a very, very crude rule of thumb, is I like to see at least 50 animals in the denominator before I'm going to calculate anything. So going back to that 100-cow herd that I want to calculate DA rates, if I want to get at least 50, I'm going to need something like 5 or 6 months worth of calvings before I'm really going to have confidence in that number changing. That in itself, in a nutshell, is what makes small herd records analysis exceedingly difficult, because now we've added 5 or 6 months into our calculation. We've got a lot of time behind it, and we've had feeding changes, we've had weather changes, all kinds of other things. And one of the big advantages of looking at these types of metrics on large herds is that there's enough animals that we can calculate these in as little as a week amount of time, but typically over a month period of time. And we can more quickly see when things are going awry, if there really has been a change that warrants our intervention. That example I showed before with the DAs, just having one more animal with the DA going from 0 to 10% DAs, that would not warrant investigation and doing something about it. But if this was a herd that was calving 500 cows a month and we went from a 0% DA rate to a 10% DA rate, that would be a catastrophic failure. That would be going from 0 DAs to 50, and that would certainly warrant us investigating and intervening and trying to figure out what the problem is. So again, the 50 is not some great statistical number that somebody came up with. It's just a crude number, but more than anything, just consider how many animals are in every calculation. Don't make too much of a number that has too few cows in it. All right, momentum is when too much time goes into the calculation. Large changes have a small impact on the number, so it makes it difficult to detect when there's a change. We've got an awful lot of numbers with this. Here's one just looking at pregnancy rate on a herd. This happens to be a PC Dart printout, and if you look on the, I'm going to see if I can use my pointer here, and if we look at this last column, okay, or the second to last column where the pregnancy rate is, if you look at all those numbers rolling down there, they're all fairly consistent. We get a little bit of ups and downs, but mostly in the mid-20s there. And then we get all the way down to this most recent cycle. That's a 16%. And that, this is an older chart that I pulled, but if you look at the date range, it's the most recent date range where we've checked on this dairy. And we look at that 16 and say, wow, that is a significant departure from where this herd has been. Something really changed. And given the time frame or the season there, and we might just say heat stress was what the issue was. I don't know what it was on this dairy, but that 16 is a departure. Conversely, we could also look at the average for the year, which would be 25%, and think about what went into that 25% calculation. It's basically everything above it. It's a weighted average of all those eligible and pregnant animals above. And so the question is, if we were only monitoring that bottom number, that 25%, if that was the only number that we were monitoring, how many bad cycles would we have to have before that number changed enough to grab our attention and say, whoops, something's changed here, we better go out and do something about it? And it would certainly be more than one cycle. It would probably more like 3 or 4 bad cycles we would need to say, wow, that number has changed enough that we need to intervene. But looking at this cycle by cycle, we could sure say, wow, something big happened here. Let's at least investigate and see if this warrants intervention, but that's a big change. So we go over to my crude rule of 50 and say, okay, this cycle had 200 eligible cows, so I'm going to conclude that there's enough animals in each one of those cycles to say that that's a real change. That's just not a variation issue or a figment of our imagination, that really did change. So you can see here with momentum and variation, we kind of need to balance the two. We want to have enough time that we have enough cows in our metric, but we don't want to have too much time that we've got more momentum and negates our ability to find changes quickly or delays our ability to see when the change occurred. So in a herd like this with 200 animals in a cycle, I'd leave these cycles right where they are. If this was a small herd where our number, this is roughly a 1,000-cow dairy, so if this was a 100-cow dairy, we'd have roughly 10% as many eligible animals. We'd have something like 20 or 25 eligible animals. That's not enough, and what we see that cycles on those dairies with very few cows, we get an awful lot of bouncing up and down or variation. Cycles going from 15 to 30 to 20, and people look at that and say, geez, this doesn't tell me a daggone thing because they're up one week I'm great, one cycle I'm great, next cycle I'm terrible and up and down. So again, we need to consider that and put it all together, make sure that we've got enough time to get enough observations, but not too much time that we've got too much momentum. It's a balance for each dairy, and again, this is where we need to think about what we're looking at, think about how we're measuring it, and it's going to be unique for each dairy, and we need to think about it uniquely on each dairy. Okay? So some of the transition numbers that have momentum, things like peak milk, days open, calving intervals, many others, but they're all numbers that have a lot of momentum behind them. Again, by the time these things change the way they're traditionally calculated, we've dug a hole that's pretty deep. We just can't afford to wait that long. We need to jump on it quicker. Okay? Bias is simply errors that occur when data is ignored, not used in the calculation. This is common with some reproductive metrics, but we also bias numbers by not including failures. But I'll go through a very quick and simple reproductive conception rate example. So it just points out this is just very, very simple math. Everybody knows this, but I'll go through it anyways. First service conception rate for pens of breeding heifers. So in my simple little example here, there's 2 breeding pens with 100 heifers in each pen. And in pen 1, we didn't give the breeder any tools at all. Just said go out and breed heifers. And over a 21-day period, let's say of those 100 open heifers, they actually bred 50 of them. And 40 of those 50 actually got pregnant from those breedings. So our first service conception rate would be 80%, or 40 divided by 50. So 40 of the 50 animals we bred actually got pregnant. 80% first service conception rate. Most people would say, that's pretty good conception rate. So pen 2, we gave the breeder a tool or tools of some kind that enabled them to get semen in everybody. You pick the tool. So there was 100 heifers, 100 open heifers. Over a 21-day period, they got semen in all 100 heifers, and 60 of them were subsequently checked pregnant at preg check. So that's a 60% first service conception rate, or 60 divided by 100. So we look at that and say, if conception rate was our metric, if that's what we put on our sheet, on whatever format we had for checking fresh cows and seeing how conception rates were going, we'd say, my gosh, we'd rather have pen 1, 80%, that's a better breeder, better feeder, whatever, everything's going better in pen 1, when actually we got 20 more heifers pregnant in pen 2. So conception rate is a biased number because it ignores animals that weren't bred. In pen 1, the 50 animals that were not bred are completely ignored in the calculation of conception rate. So that doesn't make conception rate a meaningless calculation. It just means we've got to know what the breeding program is and what went into it. We sure can't compare when we're looking at first service conception rates on a milking herd for, say, first lactation animals. We sure can't compare conception rates between a herd that's 100% timed AI on first service versus another herd that's just tail chalking and watching for standing heats. And then, of course, we have herds that are everywhere in between. So it's really problematic for sure to compare between herds or benchmark unless we know the breeding program intimately, or even within a herd, we can have some changes going on over time in the breeding program and how they're executing it. So we just need to be careful. Again, doesn't make it a worthless measure at all, but it's just one that we have to be careful and know what we're looking at and be sure we're comparing apples and apples. Okay, so some other numbers with bias in transition metrics. First service conception rate I just went through. Peak milk, days open, calving interval. Okay, there's others. Basically any number we look at when we don't include our failures, we're biasing our numbers by throwing out our failures, and that certainly gives us an inappropriate view of transition performance. Okay, so what are some of the questions related to transition success? Again, back to those 3 areas I said in the beginning. Let's ask some questions and pick out some metrics that are appropriate. I think these 3 areas, again, are healthy transition, getting cows ready to conceive, and getting off to a good start in lactation. So for healthy transitions, these are some of the questions that I ask. Yours may be different, but these are ones that I think are relevant. How many cows are leaving in early lactation? Again, separating these by parity. How many cows are getting sick? Are cows eating well? What do they look like? All right, so some of this involves looking at numbers on a herd management program. Others involve being at the dairy and actually looking at cows. And so we need to consider both of those. So some metrics I like to answer those questions. I happen to like 30 and 90-day cull rates. Some people like 60s, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to look at 45, there's no magic in where these numbers are arbitrarily chosen to stop to say, hey, we're going to count up and measure. I think as long as you're consistent in how you do it, I think any time point is probably okay. You need to consider whether you're going to do this as cohorts or just as monthly cull rates. I think each have their advantage. Cohorts would be where we take an animal that's calved in a given window. Let's say right now we're looking we're at November 19th. If we showed up on a dairy and we wanted to do 30-day cull rates, we could get animals that calve, say, in the month of September, and say how many of those were gone by 30 days in milk. We couldn't yet do a cohort for the month of October, a 30-day cull rate cohort, because the animals that calved at the end of November, or end of October, have not yet completed 30 days in milk. So any cohort analysis, we need to be careful that all animals complete the cohort. There's kind of a little bit of lag in there, it seems like, when you're calculating those. So computationally, they're most correct. The other way to do this is monthly. Just say, hey, we showed up at the dairy November 19th. I want to look what happened the last 30 days. So take the fresh events the last 30 days and number of cows dead and sold. The denominator and numerator are not precisely correlated in that case, but it does give you a little quicker answer as to how things are going. So as long as you know what you're doing there and you're doing it consistently, I think you can probably see which way the bus is heading. And that's really what we want to do with all these metrics, is we want to figure out when's the time to intervene, when has our performance gotten worse to where there's something going on that we can't explain and we need to start investigating. So these are kind of some crude goals that I set up at 30 and 90-day rates for lactation equal 1 and lactation greater than 1. You know, they certainly can change based on what the dairy is trying to accomplish. We're certainly seeing people being more aggressive on D&Bing fresh cows or moving them out of the herd quickly. Heifers that come in that just aren't milking well, getting them out quicker. So again, we've got to know the herd and know what they're trying to accomplish, but I think we can set up reasonable goals for each herd and track those. So I put a lot of weight on these in terms of health, how quickly cows are leaving the herd. I still think for the most part those early lactation losses are ones we typically want to try to avoid if they're not dairy culls. Next, looking at health events, DAs, RPs, metritis, mastitis, they're the big ones that I typically look at. Milk fever, I suppose, if the dairy has some of that, to just follow rates of those. I like to do those on a monthly basis, again, making sure there's enough animals. I happen to learn a lot from tracking those over time. It's nice to look at them by monthly cohorts, and we can really see seasonal impacts, feeding change impacts, those sorts of things, and I think they say a lot about how healthy cows are transitioning. I like to look at cows that what I call fall through the cracks, and so I just broadly say the percent of cows under 40 days in milk that are less than 50 pounds. That would obviously be different depending on what breed of cows, and milking frequency and so forth can change a little bit of that. You know, how I come up with some of these numbers is just watching herds over time and seeing herds that perform extremely well, what their numbers look like, herds that don't perform as well, but some measurement of how many cows are falling through the cracks. I think that's a good indicator of transition health, because if we got a lot of cows that really aren't milking well, that means they probably had some sort of disease or sickness or something bad happened to them through transition. Cows that come through that are healthy, Holsteins, ought to milk better than 50 pounds. If they don't, either they're genetic freaks, which can happen with first lactation, or they've had some sort of health issue. So again, don't get caught up on the 50 pounds necessarily, but more the concept of finding cows that fell through the cracks. So metrics I use with caution in transition, dry matter intake in the close-up pen. Boy, that's a tough number to gauge at. We got animals that are in their half days and two-thirds of days. There's constant movement in that pen. You know, are pen counts really right? What about refusals? There tend to be an awful lot of refusals in that pen to make sure cows don't run out of feed or they being accounted for properly. There's just a zillion errors with close-up dry matter intake. So I'm not saying don't look at it, but just be careful and see what's going on. Talk to the dairy about how they've been feeding if you see big changes in that, and don't make too much of it. Make sure you know what's going on. Same in the fresh pen. Again, it's a pen in flux. There's daily animals being added, sometimes daily animals being moved out, and we aren't always correcting for that properly in our feeding programs, keeping pen counts just right. So those numbers can get a little boogery. We sure want to know what cows are eating. I'm just not sure the dry matter intake that we report out of our feeding programs is the best indicator of that. I think talking to people on the dairy, looking at cows and seeing how they're eating may be just as worthwhile. I certainly don't like looking at fat percent. So as I said earlier, fat percent of fresh cows and their inversions and ratios of fat to protein don't mean a whole lot to me. And so I just avoid looking at those because I've never found them to be useful. Doesn't mean other people haven't. I just haven't found that useful myself. What are some future metrics out there to look at healthy transition? I think some indication of ketosis in the fresh pen, beta-hydroxybutyrate in milk is out there. I think these things will be automated more so in the future. There may be some other physiological parameters we look at in milk of fresh cows to tell us something about the health or of that group or the relative risk of them developing something like ketosis. Body weight in fresh cows, I think, is really intriguing. Not many dairies, or really hardly any, are able to do that. But some of the data I've seen really looks intriguing in terms of when a cow gets sick, body weight's really the first thing to change, and I think that may be something we use in the future. Temperature in fresh cows, there's some new monitors are out now that are able to supposedly deliver that. I don't have experience with it. There's also rumination technology out there now to look if cows are ruminating. We've got activity technology to see if cows are resting. So I think in the future we'll have some more metrics to look at. I don't really know if they're going to tell us a lot more than what we've already shown, but there's certainly going to be more out there. Again, the goal of most of these things, I think, are looking at whether they're healthy or not. So the next question is related to the next topic. Are cows ready to get pregnant? I think body condition is a big part of that, just visually appraising cows, seeing if they're losing too much condition, how they look when they're entering that breeding window. Then I like looking at insemination rates and pregnancy rates of cows within the first 21 days after we say we're trying. So basically, if our voluntary wait period is 50 days or 60, within the first 21 days or so, how successful are we at getting semen into cows? How successful are we at getting them pregnant? And just measure the dairy against itself over time, trying to improve and chart progress. I think that's a worthwhile way to go about it. Metrics I like, again, for getting cows pregnant, the first cycle preg rate and service rates, I really like those. Do it for recent calvings. Try to narrow that recent calving window down as tight as you can and still have enough animals so we can really see timely changes. Scatter plot of days to first breeding versus date. You know, most all software programs allow you to do that just to see if we're still getting semen consistently in around the voluntary wait period or whether we're starting to get a lot of drift. And I still like looking at percent pregnant by X days in milk. I happen to choose 100 and 150. You could choose other points. But that kind of takes a lot of the bias of looking at a voluntary wait period and different breeding programs. That, you know, gee, I don't care what your voluntary wait period is. If you can get 75% of your herd pregnant by 150 days in milk, I think you're doing quite well. So the problem with those is they tend to have a fair amount of time behind them, and they're not as sensitive to change as some of the other metrics, but I still think it's a good enough number that I like tracking it, even though it does have a fair amount of momentum behind it. Okay, conception metrics to use with caution, repro metrics, the conception rates, I've been over that, and that's the big one. Everybody wants to grab first service conception rate, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as we understand the calculation in which cows go into it. It can be fraught with error, okay? I don't like days open and calving interval. I just avoid using them altogether. So in terms of fresh cow milk, are cows ramping up quickly? That's what I want to know. Hey, once they hit feed in a fresh pen, are they taking off? How are they milked during the peak window, and how many cows are falling through the cracks? Some of the ways I look at that are I like week 4 and week 8 milks. Most of our software programs have these type of numbers now. You could choose week 3 and week 9. There's really no magic in 4 and 8. It's just what I've always been comfortable with. I think week 4 estimates startup. That's day 21 to 28, just the 4th week of lactation. Week 8 is just the 8th week of lactation. I think week 8 better approximates peak. For most animals, adult cows anyways, that's kind of the peak window. Some people may choose a week 10 or week 12. I think all those are okay. Again, just looking at when cows start up. Percent over 100 pounds in the herd, I still like that. And we'll talk about components here in a minute to adjust for that. These failure cows I mentioned earlier, how many cows are falling through the cracks, and 305 MEs on second test day. I think that's also a worthwhile thing to look at. All right. I don't like peak milk. I don't like first test day milk. I mentioned those. I don't like lactation curves. There's too much seasonal issues going on there. Too many things I can't explain with cows leaving, and the list goes on and on. I've never been comfortable with lactation curves. I've never really liked that type of analysis. So let's morph here. Right now, we're just about done. A few more minutes left. Why do we ignore components when assessing cow performance? I think this is something that we, as an industry, when we assess cow performance, we almost always just completely ignore components and don't think about how much fat or how much protein is in the milk, because what we're really looking at in cow performance from a milk standpoint is we're really trying to gauge economic output of the cow. What kind of income is she generating per day? And obviously that goes a whole lot further than just looking at the actual milk she produces. So the biological ways that we typically account for this is looking at fat-corrected milk or energy-corrected milk, something like that. And these are just simply biological equations geared towards estimating the energy content of the milk. And there's nothing in any of these formulas that say anything about milk prices or price of protein, price of fat, price of other solids, all those sorts of things, essentially how a dairy is paid for their milk. None of those things are involved at all. And I think we make a serious mistake in many cases where we ignore components, because we see herds now in the dairy industry, Holstein herds, that have fats 3.9 or 4.0 and proteins at 3.2 or 3.3. We see that on the high end. We also see Holsteins on the low end being a 2.8 or 2.9 protein and a 3.4 or 3.3 fat. That's a tremendous difference in economic output if milk volume was the same. Then we throw into all the herds that are looking at crossbreeding. I happen to think those crossbreeds are really intriguing economically. Look at those in jerseys and all the different combinations we have. If we don't consider components, I think we're potentially misrepresenting or misjudging our cows. So what I look at is this money-corrected milk thing that I developed a few years ago, and this is simply to look at the economic output of cows. The units are pounds per day, and it's just the value of milk produced relative to a 3530 standard. And I use component values to determine that. So I'll go quickly through how that works. So here's the example we run into with fresh cows. So we can apply the same analogy when we're looking at a herd or when we're looking at beef cows. You know, if we got a beef list with cows under 60 pounds, well, if one cow is a 5.0 fat and a 3.6 protein, she's quite different than another cow that's a 3.2 fat and a 2.4 protein. So very, very different potentially economically. So let's look at these two cows. These are transition cows, so we're looking at milk production saying, gee, how are cows starting out in this herd? And let's say we've got cow A at 90 pounds of milk, a 4.2 fat, a 3.4 protein, and a 5.65 other solids. Cow B in the same herd, let's say, is 113 pounds, 3.3 fat, 2.6 protein, and 5.65 other solids. So which fresh cow is better? Obviously, if we looked at just pounds of milk like we normally do, cow B is far superior. She's just kicking butt compared to cow A. So we look at cow A and say, gee, why didn't she start well? Is she genetically poor? Did she get sick? What happened to her? All right, so the money-corrected milk calculation, in this example, I use $2.50 a pound for fat, $3 for protein, and 15 cents for other solids, and used milk check adjustments, because we've got to remember most dairies, how they're paid for their milk. Not only components derive the milk price, but also milk check adjustments. In this case, quality, hauling, promotion basis. You know, those are all volume-driven, hundredweight driven, where the other ones are just component-driven. So the dairies are paid in the combination of all those together. This concept can also be applied to fluid milk in the southeast and other areas. Just happen to use a component market. So based on these two, let's go back to our two cows, A and B. Well, if we use fat-corrected milk to compare them, we'd still show about a 10-pound difference. If we use energy-corrected milk, we'd still show about a 6-pound difference. But using money-corrected milk, both of those cows are exactly the same, and it relates exactly to income per cow per day. So money-corrected milk is just a milk pounds-based index of income per day that was generated. So I think we're making a mistake when we completely ignore components when assessing fresh cows or assessing overall performance of the herd. And I think we finally, or at least in my mind, I finally have a reason to look at components on a herd, fat and protein individually. You saw earlier in my talk, I'm not really a fan of looking at fresh cow fat tests or fat protein ratios and whatnot, but I am a fan of using components to assess how well cows are performing. We're making calling decisions, we're assessing our fresh cows, we're doing all that with most cases not knowing anything about the individual fat or protein, and I think we're potentially making some inappropriate decisions. So the components are a huge part of this. Again, I'm saying a 90 to 113 pound cow are exactly the same economically in this case. Quite a difference it can make. Okay, so in conclusions, I think I've more than used up my time. Understand what you're measuring, and I don't mean to be kindergartenish when I say that. We just need to really think about, we see a number on a paper that's just one number, a percentage, or whatever it is, what cows went into it, how many animals, which ones weren't included. Just think through where could this metric be going wrong to lead us to the wrong conclusion. be sure there are enough cows to determine the differences. Of course, look at the cows. We all know that looking at records, we have to use that in conjunction with the visual appraisal of the herd to see really how fresh cows are doing and transition cows. And last, don't ignore components. They absolutely drive the economic bus, and if we ignore them, we could be making inaccurate or inappropriate conclusions on cows. Okay, Donna, that's it. I think I'm 10 up. I think I did it in 45 minutes, as promised.
Thank you very much, Greg. I'm going to ask you a question, if
Sure.
that's okay.
Sure.
You talk quite a bit about fresh cow milk and metrics, week 4, week 8, or whatever the farmer wants to utilize. I think a lot of us work with smaller producers and with some producers that, because of their religious beliefs, will not use computer programs. How would you recommend we go about working with them to utilize their records to evaluate fresh cow or even milking cow performance?
Well, so a herd that doesn't have a computer, the only chance you've got really is to have if the herd's on DHI test.
They are on DHI. Assume they are.
They're data you can get into PC Dart or Dairy Comp. So as long as the herd tests, you've got all the information, and both software programs will calculate week 4 and week 8 milks. I think probably the most important part of that is regular testing. If the herd doesn't have daily meters, they're just relying on a test day milk to represent how the herd is milking. It's important that it's done every 30 days. A lot of herds are in an every other month deal or every 45 days, and I don't think that's often enough. So if the herd doesn't have meters, doesn't have a computer, doesn't have anything, once a month estimation of milk weights on the herd, the consultant can grab that from the processing center, run it through their dairy management software, and assess all the things we talked about.
Okay. How about combining that with looking at cows? You talked a little bit about just in general. I think it doesn't make any difference there. I mean, what are some key things consultants should look at as far as look at records before going on farm and then follow up once they get on farm?
Yeah, and we don't always have the opportunity to have the records before we get to a dairy. Sometimes you show up and you didn't have anything in advance, and hey, go out and look at the cows and tell me what you think. So, sometimes we see the records first and then go look at the cows. Sometimes it's vice versa. The things I look at, I like to see a fresh pen locked up and walk behind fresh cows and assess manure, body condition, gut fill, looking at their eyes and head to see if they look alert and bright. Not necessarily cud chewing, because when cows are locked up, they don't necessarily really chew their cud like they normally would. But just seeing if cows, their ears are down, you can just tell a sick cow by looking at her head, or a cow that doesn't feel well. So I just like walking through and looking at all those things, brightness of hair coats, general appearance of the cows, and then after they've been let out of the pen, watch them walk around, how quickly they lay down, how many of them have their tails up in the air or their tail not up against their vulva when they're walking around. I think just sitting out in a fresh pen for 30 to 45 minutes and just watching cows and seeing how they act, and it's kind of a hard thing to point to X, Y, and Z is what you particularly look at. I think it's more spending the time doing that, and over time, you really start to recognize cows that look better than others. So I like, and of course, we look at all the other things like, is feed pushed up and water and all that kind of stuff, but I really like just looking at the cows, looking at condition, hair coats, general appearance and manure, and just seeing how they look. That tells me an awful lot. So if I see an issue in the records, if I see a lot of cows leaving in early lactation, one of my questions is going to be, gee, why did those cows leave? If they left, if I go through their records and see the individual information and see, gee, those cows, a lot of them left that had RPs, that had metritis and whatnot, then I'm thinking nutritional, social issues, those sorts of things, stress issues. But if all the cows that left for mastitis, well, I'm going to maybe tackle that a little bit differently. So I think we use them in conjunction, what we see when we're out there. I prefer to have a look at the records beforehand, so if I see something particular when I go out there, I'm looking for, if there's been a lot of fresh cows leaving for mastitis, then I'm going to be particularly attuned to that when I'm out there and paying closer attention to what could be causing that.
Okay. We have a question in the chat box. Basically, how do herds you work with track first service conception rates to eliminate the biases you've mentioned?
Okay, Chad, I see your name there. So I told you couldn't ask me any tough questions. I see you didn't listen to me. So the way we still calculate and track first service conception rate, Chad, we just don't do that much with it. We do fairly little with it. Our primary metric is pregnancy rate. and pregnancy rate is dropping, pregnancy rate after the voluntary wait period is slipping, or overall pregnancy rate, then we'll start diving into windows of calvings and conception rates to see, gee, is it a breeder that was the problem? Is it just first service? And then again, looking at different breeding protocols for that first service. So what you could do, if your herd's big enough, you could look at all first service ovsync conceptions if the dairy's labeling them. You could look at all first service tail chalk. Then I think you're taking a lot of bias out of that calculation to say we're going to track not just overall first services, but we're going to check first services by breeding type. Then I think you probably have a better metric. The problem is you can't have 10,000 metrics to compare every month, and I think looking at pregnancy rates is an easy one to track, and if that one's off, then we start digging in deeper into conception rate, putting time and breeding type and all that kind of stuff, and trying to diagnose it closer.
This question is related more to nutrient specs for the fresh pen. What are they, and do you use the same diet for the high group as the fresh group?
I normally have a fresh ration. I don't know that it's an absolute necessity. I see a lot of herds that do really, really well without a fresh ration, and I only have a fresh ration when the dairy's big enough to actually mix and deliver it properly. I'm not going to stick a fresh pen on the ration that is too small, where the mixer is not capable of mixing that small of a ration. I normally put hospital and fresh cows on the same ration so we can get a load and have a decent size to mix. When I do with the fresh cow ration, I like that ration to hardly ever change. I like to have a little bit more effective fiber in it, and I keep starch a little bit lower. There's a lot of opinions on what that should be, but my general philosophy is having a little bit more conservative of a fresh ration and one that's very, very consistent and hardly ever changes. I think there's some pluses there, but more importantly, I wouldn't try that if the dairy wasn't big enough.
Had another question on how you calculate 40 and 100-day milk. I think it's going back to your week 4 and week 8.
Yep.
Milk.
So the week 4 milk, if you're in dairy comp, you just have to set up the item, week 4 milk, and I can't remember the item type. You can call Valley Ag, and they'll easily walk you through that. But you can set up milk for any week. In PC Dart, week 1 through week, I think 14 milk are canned database items. So you just grab that database item in a report, in like a calving cohort report to look at. So that's just as simple as that. So I'll grab those, and I'll look at them by calving cohort. So for example, I'll look at cows that freshen in September and say, what were their week 4 milk, what was their week 8 milk, compare that to cows that freshened in August and July and so forth. But even better yet, I like comparing animals that freshened September 12 to September 11. So look at week 4 and week 8 milks by parity for animals that freshened this month the same month last year to really see, hey, we're doing better, we're doing worse, because you'd expect the seasonal differences to be little when you compare the same month year to year.
Okay. I think Mike looked
so
at
Mike
dairy
Overton
comp.
just typed, thanks Mike, he put in its item type 122 in dairy comp to get milk by week. So again, it's really simple to set up. If you don't know how to do it, ask somebody or call Valley Ag. It's very, very simple and works very well.
Had another question. When you look at preg rate by parity and what happens if lactation 1 is lower than greater than 1, I believe.
Yeah, I can see that there. So again, we got to be careful. We're comparing apples and apples. So we could have a difference in abortion rate. We could have a difference in days to vet check, potentially, probably not, but potentially. And we could definitely have a difference in voluntary wait period and DNB percentage. So just be careful with all. But having said all that, you would still expect lactation equals 1 to be higher than lactation greater than 1. Typically, I see like a 2 to 4 point increase 1 over greater than 1. So if you're in the opposite scenario, the good news is I think there's a lot more value in getting older cows pregnant because of the shape of their lactation curve. But the issues that are unique to lactation equal 1 to me would be the uterus. Fresh heifers tend to get a lot more metritis issues, calving-related issues, and if they're not getting pregnant, boy, I start looking at, how many cows are clean really at the breeding window and whether we've got some uterine health issues that's really dragging that down. If it was the opposite and adult cows were really, really poor, I'd look at things like calcium metabolism that are different in adult cows, age of the cows, foot health, cow comfort, those sorts of things. But there's certainly different issues. The scenario of lactation equals 1 being lower is unusual. Not that I never see it, but it's unusual.
And with that, Greg, we thank you very much for presenting and talking about transition cows and how to get more money from them.